Buonasera a tutti e a tutte. Io sono Claudia Löfflholz, la direttrice, sento questo fischio che non mi piace, la direttrice della Scuola di Alta Formazione e del Dipartimento Educativo di Fondazione Modena Arti Visive. Ho il grande piacere di dare il benvenuto a chi è presente qui in sala e a chi ci segue in streaming, perché per chi non è a Modena è possibile seguirci anche a distanza, ma chiaramente è molto più bello stare qui insieme. Voglio introdurre qui la seconda edizione del ciclo Arte, noi e la tecnologia, che abbiamo iniziato l'anno scorso per riflettere sull'evoluzione tecnologica e le pratiche artistiche. E visto che stasera l'incontro si svolgerà in inglese, per chi non avesse ancora preso le cuffie e ne ha bisogno, potrebbe prendersela lì in fondo dove c'è la mia collega Alice. Questa era una breve introduzione anche tecnica. Allora, l'arte, noi e la tecnologia, stasera iniziamo con questo nuovo ciclo. Siamo molto contenti di avere con noi come ospite Evan Roth, che in questo momento sta un po' a distanza perché gli viene tradotto quello che io dico in italiano verso l'inglese. Perché abbiamo scelto Evan Roth? La maggior parte di voi lo sa, perché questo ciclo comunque ha due modi in cui trattiamo questi argomenti, di cui dopo faccio un breve accenno, che da un lato coinvolgiamo artisti curatori del nostro programma espositivo e dall'altra parte specialisti del campo delle arti digitali. Evan Roth in questo momento, lui ha una personale, la prima personale in Italia, in una delle nostre sedi di Fondazione Modena Arti Visive. Chi non l'avesse ancora vista, la mostra si chiama Mondi, distorti e l'ha curato Chiara Dall'Olio, che è qui presente con noi. La mostra la potete vedere fino all'11 febbraio. Con questo ciclo di incontri, quello che noi vogliamo fare, cioè i nostri obiettivi ambiziosi, non è che possiamo dare qui delle risposte esaustive, perché sappiamo benissimo quando parliamo di evoluzione tecnologica che siamo dentro un processo molto complesso e che nel momento in cui ci facciamo delle domande ne nascono altre domande a cui vorremmo avere delle risposte e non sempre ci sono. Ma quello che facciamo qui è provare a riflettere su come ha cambiato e sta cambiando la tecnologia e la nostra vita, perché indubbiamente qualsiasi età che è qui presente noi siamo immersi nella tecnologia, ce l'abbiamo in mano e la utilizziamo ogni giorno. E come questa tecnologia ha cambiato il nostro modo in cui viviamo, il modo in cui, e questo è proprio anche il legame con Evan, come noi generiamo e condividiamo i saperi e come ci affidiamo a questi saperi e questi strumenti che utilizziamo ogni giorno. Perché il lavoro di Evan, per chi ha già visto la mostra, ruota proprio intorno a queste domande, cioè come dice già il titolo della sua lecture di stasera, che è Mondi, distorti, il titolo della mostra, sistemi di rappresentazione digitale. Quello che lui fa nel suo lavoro da oramai più di 20 anni è svelare dei meccanismi invisibili, di sfidare la nostra percezione e le nostre convinzioni, perché spesso, troppo spesso, ci affidiamo a questi strumenti in un modo anche ingenuo e ci crediamo al 100% a tutto quello che vediamo e che utilizziamo, e comunque lui ci fa arrivare al punto ad interrogarci che cosa c'è dietro, e lo fa in un modo molto molto intelligente, perché da un lato chi ha visto la mostra è esteticamente un artista che ha una grande capacità di lavorare su questi temi, perché lui spazia dalla pittura al video, all'installazione, ma lavora anche tantissimo con siti web e con strumenti di condivisione libera, e uno non deve nemmeno venire a vedere la mostra. E poi comunque è un artista che da 20 anni lavora in questo campo. L'ha fatto in tanti modi, perché lui lavora nello spazio pubblico, ma lo spazio pubblico è anche il web, perché comunque tutti possiamo accedere al web. E l'ha fatto anche nelle grandi istituzioni, perché noi come FMAF siamo qui i primi in Italia, ma lui è esposto al MoMA di New York, al Jour de Paume di Parigi, al CEO di Berlino, alla Biennale di Sydney. Potrei fare un lungo elenco che ora non vi interessa così tanto. Noi siamo super felici che lui sia tornato stasera a Modena per inaugurare questo ciclo di lecture e a tenere domani una masterclass per giovani artisti alla Scuola di Alta Formazione, perché anche questo ciclo è un ciclo di lezioni aperte che sono state curate dalla scuola di alta formazione di FMAF. Che cosa voglio altro aggiungere? Che tutto questo chiaramente è possibile perché c'è una grande squadra che ci lavora. Da un lato c'è il team di FMAF che ha reso possibile questo evento e tutto il ciclo, dall'altra parte abbiamo anche i nostri partner con cui abbiamo fatto questo progetto in collaborazione, che da un lato è Future Education Modena, di cui siamo qui ospiti, che si inseriscono loro nel contesto di Ago Modena Fabbriche Culturali. E questi sono i nostri due partner del progetto, e tutta la programmazione si inserisce nella programmazione di Modena, UNESCO, Modena città creativa UNESCO per Media Arts, perché come la maggior parte di voi sa, abbiamo da oramai 3 anni, 4 anni, non sono bravissima con i numeri, l'onore di essere la prima città italiana che fa parte di questo cluster. Io direi che, a parte della tecnologia che ho già detto, le radioline, chi ne avesse bisogno ce le ha già, vi dico anche che dopo la lecture c'è spazio per le vostre domande. Allora, se avete delle cose che vi vengono in mente, ricordatevelo per la fine. E a questo punto lascio la parola a Evan, a cui ringrazio di nuovo per aver accettato questo invito per inaugurare questo nuovo ciclo di incontri. E grazie a voi per essere venuti così numerosi.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Thanks so much for that really nice introduction. Thank you. And thanks for joining. Yeah, my name's Evan. I'm an artist. I'm American. I've been living in Berlin for the last few years. I'm going to be talking about this show, Mondi, distorti. I thought I would follow a similar format actually as the catalog, which breaks this show down into these 5 series. So I'm going to sort of stick to those 5 series as a way to talk about this work. I'm going to go over the background of some of these projects, and I'm also going to hopefully show some connections between the work. One of them to be looking for, that when I look back on my work, I see a connection has to do with this idea of looking at systems, digital systems most often, and trying to find places where there's personal agency within those systems. Like, where are moments where we have something we can tweak, we can change, maybe unintended purposes for those systems, to be able to amplify our voices kind of as individuals within larger systems. That's something to be on the lookout for. Hopefully I'll connect back to that. So I'm going to start with bent networks. This is the smallest series in the show in terms of scale. It happens at the back of the exhibition space. It's maybe a smaller moment in the exhibition, but I thought it might be a nice place to start with. There are these pieces here that are connected together with Ethernet cable. And they really start there. They really start with Ethernet cable as a medium. And it's sort of a clunky medium in terms of technology. It's old, it's a big plug. Macs won't even let you plug into them anymore without a dongle. I wonder if this laptop, yeah, this laptop still has one, so that's nice. But it's a medium that I really enjoy because, and my enjoyment of it relates back to this diagram, which, if anybody has any sort of familiarity with net art, this is from 1997 from an artist group called MTAA, where they were trying to sort of describe this burgeoning form of art and describe what it was. And it was something different than just art that's documented and shown on computer screens. It had more to do with the medium of the web being connected computers, and what's artwork that could happen uniquely and specifically within that medium. And so this was a big inspiration for me. I mean, this diagram maybe a bit, but the net art scene in general was a big inspiration. And so the Bent Network series really starts in those 2 places, Ethernet cable and that diagram. And to me, it exists sort of in this place between these 2 systems that are maybe beyond my comprehension, right? When I'm plugging this laptop into the internet via Ethernet cable, what's happening on this laptop, I have very little knowledge of, and I'm not really invited in to understand it either, right? Like, even computers, Macs, are using screws that we don't even have the right driver to unlock, right? There's not a big invitation into these devices to understand them. And even if I got in there, technically, as they get more complicated and more miniaturized, I don't know what's happening. On the other end of that Ethernet cable, when it connects to the internet, it's another gigantic system that I feel like I don't have a full grasp of how it works and how it functions and all the places that connects it to. But for this one brief, awkward moment, all of that's happening between this one cable that I kind of get, right? This one piece of plastic that wraps around some copper. And for this one moment, I can sort of touch and hold that moment where I'm connected to the internet. And so the Bent Network series is really about embracing that one little moment and making these small bends, these small gestures, these moments that are maybe whimsical, and being playful maybe in that moment. So whether I'm stitching it through marble, making some nice knots. I had to learn how to make knots and how to do some sewing for this project. And so there's this playful moments with the work, but it's also trying to get back to that idea of agency. Like, where is that moment within the network where I have agency, even if it's only for this very brief moment, to make this small bend in that system that technically will have an imperceptible change on your experience of that network. To me, it's still sort of an interesting moment to exist within. And maybe a part of net art that interests me, that I feel like is maybe underexplored within the scene, is its availability in the home to have a primary art experience. Like, I love the idea with net art that you can have this primary experience of the work in the home and live with it over an extended period of time. And bent networks are fitting within that thinking for me, meaning that you could take one of these sculptures in your home, connect it between where the internet comes into your modem and before it broadcasts from your router. And then anything you do within your home now is going through that bend. It's going through that sculpture. And so these are some of those pieces which, if you've seen the show, you've seen the works. They all sort of daisy chain together. So if you follow one to the next, to the next, to the next, they're all connected and they're all functional. The internet's flowing through them all, so they're activated sculptures in that sense. And they all connect to, and this leads me to the next piece in the show, which is kind of a very big bent network sculpture, but this is the pyramid piece. This is the ... is the title, which I'll explain in a moment. And this piece, I explained this earlier to the group of students that came through, so you'll have to permit me to duplicate this story a second time if you're here. But this piece and pyramids in general, which show up in my work a lot, they start from this moment, which is the Pirate Bay. And has anybody used the Pirate Bay? You'd be admitting to a crime. Yes. The Pirate Bay for me personally was a really big turning point. I was doing architecture at the time, and there was things happening on the internet that were exciting to me. There were peer-to-peer networks forming. And when the Pirate Bay made this invitation to the world of every piece of software, every book, every piece of music, every film, and they did it not from a standpoint of trying to make money, but as making a sort of statement about sharing and about filing and what the nature of digital should be. This to me, especially as a younger version of myself, was immensely inspiring, very empowering, and it really was the impetus to have me sort of moving away from architecture and more into the arts. And okay, long story short, Pirate Bay, sometimes it has it even still nowadays, but if you check it on the Wayback Machine, for a long time it had this little pyramid shape at the bottom. And if you would click on it, it took you to a page called copyme.com, which is different now. So you have to view this in the history of the internet if you want to go look at it. And it didn't offer that much information. It was just a series of these pyramid shapes and some text at the top that says, copy me, symbol showing that you want to be copied. Use copy me in your fancy. And it didn't say much about what it was, and it wasn't a legal construct like Creative Commons. It was more of like a moral compass that a group of people came together and would show this sort of badge, being like, I'm a part of this scene, I'm a part of this movement. I want my work to be copied, I want to copy other work. And it was sort of about forming a community around this idea of file sharing. And so my website now has a Copy Me logo on it in these 12 colors that I paint with, which I'll talk about more in a bit. And I started for this talk looking back at all the pyramids when I was collecting images to put together about all the pyramids that show up in my work. So I'm just going to scroll through them, but this is one from 2015. This is one made out of cables from 2017 called Burial Ceremony. This is one I didn't think about when I made this piece, but this is a pyramid made out of Wi-Fi routers, which is very connected. This is from 2014. If you look in the landscapes room in the back of the exhibition, which has these infrared videos, you can find more evidence of pyramids in there. So on the left is one that sits on top of where the original telegraph cable came up in Cornwall. The one on the right, on the front side of this sign, it just says cable, hand painted in black, and this is marking the point where the fiber optic cable comes ashore in New Zealand. There's pyramids that show up in other pieces in the exhibition. And this, I found, this was the original sketch for the piece that's now on display in the show. This is from 2019, and I was thinking, how could I make a functional pyramid, one that exists out of Ethernet cable and that could have internet flowing through it? This was sort of the second sketch, and then the kind of other piece of this puzzle for me, at least in the research phase of the work, is that I'm also very interested in thinking about radio and sort of inspired by radio as a telecommunications system that has a very different history and has a different relationship with infrastructure. And so this is a radio tower that Italian radio inventor or early inventor of radio, Marconi, built, and it was one that was designed to send the first radio signal, the first wireless communication across the Atlantic. And so you can obviously see how excited I was when I found this image of this inverted pyramid. And part of my interest in radio, anyway, and thinking about radio, is that there's very few moments in the landscape where we get clues as to what's actually flowing around us all the time. Meaning, and this maybe goes back to my architecture background and having an interest in sort of form-function relationships, but there's not that many places where we formally get to see evidence of what's flowing all around us. And radio is one of those really beautiful moments where we get this. And so when you see a radio tower on the horizon, the height of those towers is designed in proportion to the wave that they're transmitting. Maybe 1-to-1 scale, maybe 1/8 scale, but the size of those towers is not arbitrary. And so you get this, in my mind, this really beautiful moment where on the horizon you get a glimpse of these invisible signals that are, they're all around us right now in this room, Wi-Fi, 3G. There's so many of these waves right now at different distances that we just can't see because the hardware of our eyes are not attenuated to them. Also in this one, you can see do you see the pyramid also happening? Can you see it on screen? There's also a pyramid here if you look closely, happening with the cables. And so the title of this piece is ... and ... was the very first Morse code message sent from this radio tower across the Atlantic. It's the letter S. Which also makes a nice S on top of this pyramid here. Super nice. So that's the title of the work, ... This letter S also referenced this kind of waveform. And so technically the way this piece is working is in the base of that pyramid, sitting on top is a Wi-Fi router. And from the back of that Wi-Fi router, you get one Ethernet cable that comes out and then starts going to and from that plinth to the ceiling until it makes this pyramid shape. And then it goes off from the corner, up into the ceiling, around the corner. It connects through all of those bent network pieces that we saw earlier before rounding the corner, plugging into the internet switch that's on the floor in the landscapes room. From the back of that, you can find one little cable that disappears behind the wall before it connects to the building's internet connection, which of course then goes out to connect to other moments in the internet, to the cloud, right? And so the way you can, one way you can interact with that as a viewer is if you connect to the ... wireless network within the gallery space. It'll connect you to that router. And once you're connected to that router, part of my thinking is that it just becomes this physical manifestation of this web, this place where you can share space with the internet. And again, it won't change your interactions with the web. It's just a free, open connection to the web. You're free to go wherever you want at that point. And my invitation would be to connect to it and then be sort of thoughtful about it, thinking, if you squint your eyes and think about the data leaving your phone, traveling through this pyramid shape, traveling through all these sculptures, and what connections will you make? How does that hopefully become some sort of temple, for lack of a better word, for thinking about this interaction we have for the web and between people and what information we send? And so that could be text messages to a friend, family member. There's a moment, if you take a photo of that piece and upload it, it means that data of that photo is then traveling through the actual thing that you're photographing. So there could be these kind of meta moments with the work, but the piece is meant as this sort of invitation to sit with, spend time with, and sort of commune with the internet. Okay, so that was Bet Networks and ... The smaller back room with these very slow-moving infrared video pieces is this series called Landscapes that I've been doing since 2016. And they really start with the fact that I was introduced to a very different internet than I exist with now. And I think a lot of my art practice really deals with this idea or this condition that I feel like I sort of grew up with the internet in a certain way, and that when the internet was in its adolescence, I was kind of in my adolescence, and that we've sort of grown and maybe gone different directions at certain points. But my experience of the web is also tied into my own experience of growing with the web. And so the web that I was introduced to was really a very different internet landscape. And going back to this idea of peer-to-peer networks, this was a big part of my interactions with the web. It didn't happen through a browser. It happened through peer-to-peer software. It was connecting to different users. I can still remember what it felt like when MP3 technology dropped, and I was just dropped everything. It was just like, I can really just download all this music, all these CDs that I've been spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars on that I already bought when they were tapes. Like, I remember that moment. It was extremely influential, and meeting people through these networks and realizing that we are all coming together to really change an industry, for better or for worse. It was very empowering. And so that internet, that early internet, and it changing into something else is really kind of maybe a central point in a lot of the work I'm making right now, because it is a different internet now, and I'm still trying to find beautiful moments in it, which the landscape series, hopefully I will address some of those. But there was a moment when I was questioning whether I wanted to be making work and involving my work so centrally with the net, because it was turning very commercial. It was being monetized. In the beginning was less the case. The NSA spying scandal was kind of, everybody knew it, but then when it became so publicly aware that we were also it was a system for control, that was not a nice moment. And then just the general sort of centralization of the web, like the web that inspired me to go into this field and be making work within it, was very different. It was all these different networks, different weird home pages. And now as everything sort of slowly is like this constellation that's condensing down to like Google and Amazon and Facebook and a few others, this also is a condition that I'm less excited about. This quote from Astra Taylor's The People's Platform, this is from 2014. This is also in my thinking a lot, inspiring to me at the time. And she and others were talking about this idea of, her quote, structurelessness becomes a way of masking power, right? Like, we've lived with the internet long enough to be asking tough questions. What is it? Where is it? What does it look like? What national borders does it exist within? What corporations own it? As the internet sort of transitioned from being funny cat videos and animated GIFs to something very different, these questions became more and more important. And it was something I became interested in thinking about also. And one of the ways that some people were starting to deal with that issue were making these trips to go visit the internet, to go see what it was. Some of this for me was from Andrew Bloom's Tubes book, where he talks about this idea of going to visit the internet. And so I decided, okay, before I quit making work on the net, before I totally give up on net art as a practice, let me try to go change my relationship with it, or change my understanding with it. And so the first trip I did in 2014, this was to Cornwall, the like westernmost tip of the UK. This is where, if you want to stand on top of the most data flowing through fiber optic cables, this is where you go. And a couple things to mention from this first trip, because it ties into the series, is one, these landscapes, kind of by the way that fiber optic engineers lay cables, they set up these landscapes to have this sort of dichotomy of very remote, alone horizon lines, and then vast amounts of data just underfoot. So there's this kind of interesting tension that, to me, I really felt when I was there. Like, you go to these beaches, which are picked because when you're putting down fiber optic cable, the things that you don't want are anchors and nets. You don't want a lot of boats around. You don't want a lot of people around. You can't afford to put barbed wire over the whole internet. And so instead of coming up in the center of town, you come up in these beaches that are out in the middle of nowhere. And so you end up with these landscapes that to me were just really beautiful. If you're going to visit, if you're thinking about connectedness, they become, in my mind, very opt landscapes to visit. So that was one thing I noticed. And the second thing was how quickly, when you go visit the internet, you start seeing signs of both history and power structure. So this is on that same trip. This is, you can't tell, it's like a old yellow 70s hand-painted sign that just says telephone cable, which to me is such an amazing understatement for what's happening underfoot. And then it's right next to this World War II military bunker. So you have these sort of, the network and history and power, they immediately were like butting up next to each other in the landscape. And so after that trip, I knew I wanted to do more of them. And it sent me down a path of thinking about like what would be a more opportune way of documenting those landscapes. Like I think a lot about the importance of media in the work and what would be the right media to document this work in. And in the research phase, I came across this number, 1550 nanometers. This is the distance between waveforms of the infrared laser light that flows through fiber optic networks. So this is, in my mind, one way of thinking about the sort of medium of the web is this wavelength, is this spectrum of light, which sits right on top of the visible light spectrum. So it's what's called the near infrared region. It's like between visible light and before you get to this sort of predator heat sinking light. And a good, maybe a lucky point for me is that most sensors in digital cameras can actually sense in this near infrared range. At the factory level, they put one of these little blue clear chips on top of the lens to block out those wavelengths because they mess with the color correction. But if you're brave, there's very good tutorials online these are from lifepixel.com. You have to really take the whole camera apart, and the screws are very tiny. But if you trust the instructions and you put them all back together, what you see when you look through the viewfinder are images like this, where it's not tinted, it's not a post-processing. This is what you see when you look through the actual camera. And to me, this became a really interesting way to start looking at these landscapes. So now I have a camera that's looking at these landscapes, that has a lens that's looking through this wavelength that is in the same sort of spectrum as that the internet modulates at when it goes through fiber optics. And then this became how I started documenting those landscapes. So I would go out to these, I would study the network map, find out where it's landing, find places to go visit. And then when I would get there, my thinking when I got there was that I would actually try to forget about all this. Like when I'm making work and I talk to my students about this, research is a big part of it, but I try to build in moments that are more intuitive. And so my working process was I do this research, I end up on this beach with this specific camera for all these sets of reasons. But then when I'm there, I sort of let the lens wander and find its own sort of home and where it wants to go. And yeah, I was getting back to this idea of sort of trying to figure out appropriate ways for capturing all the unseen parts of these landscapes that are all around us. And I was, through that project, getting a lot more interested, not just in networks, but also in landscape and the history of landscape and the history of landscape-based image making. And part of my thinking was I was trying to come up with a way to take that history and still build upon the ordering principle of the horizon line is kind of what most landscape-based images are based on, and trying to figure out a way to marry it with this other ordering principle of this wavier line that exists within the electromagnetic spectrum. And so the landscape series for me was trying to come up with this one sort of singular gesture that's documenting a landscape that has a duality, but trying to figure out how to document both the seen and the unseen in this way that connects to the history of landscape making, but is cognizant of what's happening with technology and around us, underneath us, and in the air right now. I was going to demo this piece. I might just skip it. The pieces, they're all online. What time is it? Let me see how much I should speed up. Yeah, I'm going to skip this. The pieces are all online, so I invite you, you can experience them in the gallery, and if they're interesting to you, you can pull them up in a browser at home and live with them. Part of the work technically is that the videos you're looking at are housed on servers in the same landscape. This was the idea of the performance of the work, parts of which have sort of come to an end. But the idea is that in this example, this is a landscape from Cape Town. The video file being in a server in Cape Town, then when you pull it up in a browser, you're activating that path. You're activating this path of infrared light between your device and this server farm in Cape Town. And so you're also sort of experiencing that network in this other way. And to come back to this net art diagram, part of this sort of, I was hoping the thing I was adding to this conversation was that as this diagram has aged, and through writing like Astra Taylor's and like Andrew Bloom's, we now know that these computers are not floating within a white void, but we know that these computers now exist within national borders and are owned by corporations. And so part of Landscapes was also tied into this diagram and thinking about what if we place that diagram on the globe. Okay, quickly I'll talk about this one. This is kind of the handoff between the Landscapes and the more recent work with the paintings. And as that project was going on over the after maybe a couple of years, part of what was, I was really going through this love affair with Landscapes more than I was with the network at that point. And part of what I really loved about learning and being introduced to this world of landscape-based image making was that it was kind of deceiving in its innocence, I would say. Like Landscapes, they're the imagery that you see at the dentist's office. You might see them when you go renew a passport or something. They feel very safe to hang on a wall in public. And kind of nerds that get into landscape theory, they very quickly can show you exactly how these images are depicting everything but, and how they have so much to do with nationalism and ownership and labor and access. And that when you start dissecting images like this Windows XP desktop and realizing that there's so much more than just green grass and blue sky, to me, this became really fascinating and also a way for thinking about networks, right? That networks are not just cables underground and servers are not just computers within dark rooms, but these are also connected to history, also have ideology. And so to sort of maybe illustrate that point, these three maps from left to right are showing British imperialism on the left, where you have British Empire, territories and colonies highlighted in red. The middle map is showing the telegraph network routes, and then the map on the right is showing the fiber optic routes. And so there's so much overlap between these three maps and so much connection between our modern infrastructure of the fiber optic network and this very early network, which was called the All Red Line. And it was called the All Red Line because this is the first globally connected cable. This is the first cable to stretch around the world. This was the telegraph network that connected all of the British colonies and territories. It was meant as this military advantage where they could have a communication systems around the world, only landing at these territories that they owned. And so this is really the predecessor of our modern network. A lot of those beaches that I went filming with are the same beaches that this cable landed at. And so the network map that makes up Landscapes project is this one, which has these similar nodes. And so this is why when I'm installing the work, I'm often looking for ways of connecting back to history. So whether it's through the architecture of the building or the sort of salon style installation, and trying to make that connection both with landscape and with networks, and thinking about how both of those systems can carry ideology through history in ways that maybe are unexpected. And so this is really the connection to the cartography painting-based work that I'm going to talk about next, which I still have some time for. One was this interest in maps. Like I was getting more and more interested in maps as I was thinking about landscapes. There's this connection there. And I was also getting much more interested in slowness. Like a lot of the earlier work, Domenico knows, was embracing speed, was really thinking about, okay, things are moving fast. And there was a moment when I felt young enough to keep up with that speed. And there was even a moment when I felt like the web was, as artists, as individual makers, we were able to kind of outpace what was happening commercially online, politically online, and that we had a moment to interject because we could outpace it. And as my thinking on that switched, which very much has to do with me getting older, with the internet getting older, slowness became interesting to me. Slowness almost as the antithesis to accelerationism, like that it might be a way of struggling against it. The same way that slow food is a sort of way of struggling against fast food, slow art making became really interesting to me. Also, like not just on the making side, but also slow art viewing is very interesting to me. It's another reason why I'm interested in art in the home and living with art. This is a shot of this book by Andrew Bloom, who talks a lot about slow art. He's an academic from Duke in the US. And a lot of his book rang really true for a lot of the things I was doing. But one thing he mentioned, there's many things, but one thing that stuck out to me was he talked a lot about how painting was this original slow art practice, that now image making is so instant that we can take hundreds of images and it feels like nothing, right? But there was a moment when if you wanted to make an image, you have to sit down and it might take you a week or a month to make that image. And that painting by definition had slowness sort of built into it. And so with those two things sort of swimming in my head, this like interest in maps, especially in how they might be connected to ideology, and then slowness, cartography and painting sort of were something I knew I wanted to make a show with, and that was what turned into this Strand series. To do that, because I'm not a painter or a cartographer, I knew I was going to need software. So the first step in the Strand series was to build software. So I started working with an artist who's a really brilliant artist, but also a very brilliant programmer named Cesar Mocan, who has an opening tonight in Berlin, actually. And he was a studio assistant of mine, and we started working on this software together. And then after he left and went and did his own work, we stayed in touch. And when I had funding, I would hire him. And over the course of a couple of years, we developed this software called Worlds and Figures, which exists in a browser. It's also online for free. And this became the way that I was learning about cartography and building upon that, hopefully. But also it was a tool for me to make work. He told me, he was like, this is the first time I've had where I've acted as a developer on a software piece where nobody got to use the software for 3 years except you. I was like, okay, that's interesting. So for 3 years, it was just me using this software. Now it's gotten to the point where it functions well enough to sort of put it out in the world. Maybe I can pull it up here. I won't go through all of this. For those of you that are in the masterclass tomorrow, we'll go into this in more detail. But this is what the software looks like when it loads up. Maybe I'll increase the world map just so you can see it a bit. The nuts and bolts of this software exist within this one drop-down menu here. And this drop-down menu is where you can see all the different mapping projections that are included here. I think there's 120. And when you click them, it'll change the way the world is represented. This moment was actually what really started me down this path also, as I was working with another piece of software that was a mapping projection software, and it had a similar drop-down menu. And I was thinking, no, I've never seen a drop-down menu that talks more about bias than this, right? It's like, it's just over 100 different algorithms, all made by white men. And when you click them, it changes the world into their vision of the world. I was like, I want to remake that as an art piece. And so this is also kind of what my software does. And so I've tried to put little clues in here. I've tried to embed the bias as much bias as personal bias that I can be aware of, I was trying to embed within this own software. And so these are all different ways you can click through different mapping projections. And mapping projections, for those that might be not as familiar, they're essentially just ways of taking a spherical set of data like the globe and flattening it. Like how do you take the globe and make it flat? And the answer is you can't. There's no way to do it perfectly. Cartographers, you'll hear them talk about the orange peel problem. Like you can't peel an orange and flatten it perfectly. There's always something has to get smushed for that process to happen. And so over the centuries, there's all these different ideas that different cartographers have had for ways of doing that, ways of flattening the globe into something that can be on a 2D surface. And from a contemporary perspective, we can now see that a lot of these mapping, a lot of them a lot of them solve some of the problems that they were designed to solve, and a lot of them embedded a lot of bias that they did not maybe intend to embed. But now, just to give one example, this slide is showing the Mercator projection, which was made in 1569 in the black outlines. This is the one most of us have seen most frequently. This is the one that Google Maps uses, for example. And in the green, it's showing a Gall-Peters projection from 1855. It's maybe less commonly seen, but the Gall-Peters is what's called an equal area projection, meaning that its design problem it was trying to accomplish was maintaining area, meaning that like the area of Africa in relationship to Europe is more correct in the green map than it is if you look in the Mercator, which is trying to preserve proportion. And so things like this is an illustration of what's called a north bias in the Mercator projection, where if you look at the scale of North America compared to South America or Europe compared to Africa, they're vastly out of proportion. And there's been studies done that show the sort of dangers in representation about who gets prioritized and deprioritized when we start representing the world in these different ways. And so this sort of, the cartography being this new rabbit hole for me, new excited place for me to be exploring. One reason that I thought it might be a good way to be talking about bias within algorithms is that my relationship, which I think is common to a lot of people's relationships with maps, is that you're introduced to them from a young age, many times in the classroom, and you're introduced to them that they are a tool to be referenced, not a story to be questioned, right? Like you'd use the map to point out, to illustrate a point. And even something as basic as north facing up was never anything that I thought about questioning until I got into this project. And so this to me is really interesting. Like the idea that something I took so for granted and realizing like this has nothing to do with science or our position within the cosmos, this north being up, you can trace it back different routes, but one place people commonly point to is the invention of the compass in China. The original compasses pointed south. Another interesting thing is these compasses were not wayfinding devices. The original compasses were ceremonial. They were so that you could figure out where to sit in relationship to the emperor. And so because these original compasses pointed south, for a long, long time, all the maps were pointing south. And then it was one Chinese emperor who lived in the north who said, I'm not living at the bottom of this page anymore. Well, let's flip them, right? And it's something, again, like thinking about how power structures in history dictate these things in ways that I wasn't so cognizant of. This is what made me think mapping might be a good way to be talking about algorithms, like in a way that's easier for me to understand that. Like if I can be looking at my phone and questioning like, what is the north up bias version of Instagram? What is the north? What is the thing that I'm taking so for granted that when it's told to me, I won't be able to see anything else? You know, all those things, all those biases are existing now. And this is me sort of wrestling through ways of understanding them. I'm going to skip a few things. There's a video essay in the exhibition that talks a lot about why I'm painting in specific colors, why you might see red lines show up in the paintings. If you look in the paintings, you'll see the all red lines show up. So there's connections in the painting series back to the landscape series. I'm going to skip through this just a little bit to save myself some time to talk about skyscapes. One thing that shows up in the paintings is you might see faces in them. This was a point in the research that was also sort of interesting and exciting and ended up in the work, which was in the sort of early and mid 1900s, there was this academic idea in cartography circles that in talking about the biases and the deformations that happen in mapping projections, the thinking was, okay, if there's no perfect representation of flat continent outlines and we don't know what they look like flat, how can we use them to be talking about distortions? Because we don't know what they should look like flat anyway. So what if we replaced all the geographic, all the continent outlines with the human face? And the idea being that we have such an intimate familiarity with the profile of the human face. Like we can see so much in how the nose changes and the lips and the chin and the forehead. Like we can immediately see differences in that in a way that we might not see in how the tip of South America rounds. And so the idea was if we replace that with the human face and those deformations happen on the face rather than the continents, that our brains are going to be able to see these easier. And so to me, this was like a really, in the one hand, really kind of poetic gesture, like that we have to see ourselves represented to understand how things are being distorted and bent. But then in the other hand, it became this other sort of lens of bias, because in any example I could find in digging through the library or online, any contemporary examples of people using this technique, it was always the man's head. Like even if you couldn't tell it was a man, they would say man's head plotted on projection. And so then the system for seeing distortion also had its own biases wrapped up in it. And then this shows up in the video essay also. In the beginning, I was thinking maybe I could make a database of these faces so that cartographers could pull from a wider range of faces rather than keep using the same face over and over again. But then that became complicated and similarly impossible. So then then the idea was to build a tool rather than a database. And this was another way that the software was sort of birthed. And the idea is that in the software, you can import your own outline. You can you can make an outline of yourself and import that. For me, the face that shows up in my software and that shows up in the paintings, it's my wife's profile. It's the profile that I know better than my own profile. It's the profile that when it bends, I notice anything that's changed. And so in that sense, the software becomes this tool that cartographers can use to sort of start to bring in profiles of faces that they have this intimate familiarity with. The handoff between the software and the canvas is there's an export functionality where I'm exporting vector files essentially that then get cut into vinyl. That adhesive vinyl becomes a painting mask, similar to like any other sort of old school modernist hard edge painting technique where you're using tape, painting layers and pulling it off. That becomes the sort of translation between the screen and the canvas. The pieces you can see in the show. I'm going to skip through these. And that leaves me just enough time for skyscapes. And the connection with skyscapes is that it's really using the same mathematics. It's using the same algorithms. In the software, the last piece I added with César was this animation feature, so that in addition to exporting vector files, the software can export animations, and you can tell it to essentially sort of spin the point that you're rotating that map around. You can change the center point of the map, and if you do that sequentially, you can turn that into a system for animation. So the place that the Skyscape series started was with my seasonal depression in Berlin, which I'm still in the middle of right now. And this is what Berlin looks like all winter. And by all winter, I mean until May, usually. And it left me like really wanting to have a better relationship with the sky. And so the beginning of Skyscapes was really anytime there would be a break in the clouds, I would go run out with my camera and I would exist with under that sky and I would document it so I could remember what it looked like. And so the first generation of the series I did in Berlin. The second series, the one that's on exhibition here, I filmed here at the Novi Arc, right? And another part of the Skyscapes for me that I realized while doing in Berlin was like this question of like, well, where do we have access to the sky? Like, especially as urbanites, like where can we get to the sky? Who has access to the sky? I was thinking about this because I have neighbors that live on the top floor, you know, I was like, they have access to the sky. And so in Modena, this became a really beautiful place to film because it was this expansive place where I could really see the horizon line. And so last April, I came and you would find me here at sunup and sundown taking a lot of photographs. And so the Skyscape series really starts there. It starts with these photographs above where I am. And another thing I was thinking about when making this series or conceptualizing it was there's this older relationship between circles and squares, and there's this saying called squaring the circle or circling the square, which people use to mean trying to solve a problem that's impossible. And it came from this Renaissance kind of like technology race to try to solve this problem. Like how, by using a compass and a straight edge, how can you draw a circle and square of equal area? This was this like nerdy mathematical race to see who could solve this first, right? Later proved that the problem was totally impossible because pi is transcendental and it's impossible. But it became interesting to me, like this relationship between circles and squares and this idea of impossibility. especially in my mind, being related to this impossibility of the perfect projection, the impossibility of systems devoid of bias. And so this relationship between circles and squares was sort of in my mind. It's also something that shows up as an archetype across different cultures and different times. Like you see these circle-square relationships happening in architecture. You see it happening in religious symbology. And it was in my head, along with the pyramids, you know, circles, squares, and triangles. It's good base material for making work, right? And so you'll see the circles and squares, they show up in the work also. And so you've probably seen these in the exhibition, but maybe I can just talk over them. The other maybe connection, if I'm trying to link some of the pieces too, is there's obviously something about slowness happening here. And so these pieces are also quite slow. And if you're in the exhibition space, of course, you're invited to sit there and stay with them as long as you feel comfortable. But these are also pieces that I think are great to live with. And to be honest, I'm this series #1 user at the moment. This is my kitchen at home. I have oversized monitors in my house because sometimes when exhibitions can't pay, I ask for the monitor. So my home has big monitors in them as payment for showing art. And so I have this nice big monitor that I put next to where I wash dishes. And I really do this. I really live with this work. And when it's gray, it's something just like putting on a record. I might put on this for a while. And if it's 3 o'clock and the sun starts going down, I can put these on and they become this like window to the sun. And I don't know if for me, I swear, I love it. It really actually feels like a window. And they're slow and there is something different. I really think this I think is a power of net art for people that aren't able to own artwork. Like I would not be if I wasn't having friends that make it or wasn't making net art. Like net art can be a way you can live with work for free in the home. And so this can be an invitation for that, because I do think that there is a way, it's part of the way I make work too. When I'm making work, I'm constantly pinning it up around my house, not in the studio, like living with it. And there's something about living with a piece of work for a month or a year where you know different things about it than you did after just a week. And so I'll leave with this small gift where I just put all of the Skyscape pieces online, so that now if you go to this link, so skyscape.es/Modena, all the pieces in the exhibition, you can click on these funny cryptic links and they load in on browsers. And so the invitation is that if you have, you know, old phones that maybe aren't that useful, or old computers, old devices, this can be a sort of second life for them in the home. And you can just pull these up in a browser and they'll just loop forever. And they can be, if you share any of my seasonal depression, or you just like to experiment with living with art, this can be an invitation to do so. So those are online as of now, so you can view them there. That's where I'm going to end. And before I wrap up, I've thanked everybody a lot, but maybe less so publicly. So the team here at FMAV, I have had the absolute best experience of making artwork over an extended period of time. So I just want to say a really big thank you, because this show for me, it was a lot of work for everyone in the show. I think we started talking about the show over a year ago. But it's just so nice. I've never done a show of this scale without having some sort of mental breakdown, stressed out panic attack moment. And there's been small moments of normal stresses, but nothing that reached that phase. And even my wife was like, it's got to be like this every time from now on. So thank you for giving me that gift of now what to expect from working with people. Thank you. And also a thanks to everybody that's been coming to see the show. Like I've noticed, I mentioned this also, but like even just being able to follow the show from abroad, I'm seeing so many people coming to the show, posting it, and more so than I see from cities 10 times the size. And so I'm also thankful for all the people that are coming to see the work, and you're part of that. So thanks for joining, and we can stick around and do some questions, I think. Thank you.
Grazie mille per questa fantastica lecture super stimolante e per i 3 regali, perché alla fine il primo regalo è la lecture a cui abbiamo assistito, Il secondo sono i complimenti che ci ha fatto, che comunque anche per chi ci lavora dietro le quinte è sempre bello avere un feedback così. Il terzo, il cielo di Modena che vi potete portare a casa, che manderò a tutti i miei amici e familiari a Berlino che sono nella stessa condizione come lui. Ma ora c'è spazio per le vostre domande. L'unica cosa che vi chiedo, chi ha una domanda, dobbiamo utilizzare il microfono perché altrimenti chi è in streaming non ci sente. Prego. Niente di domande? Ecco.
Hello, Evan. I will make it in English, if it's okay. The explanation you made, it's really nice and it's really complete. And I can see that your artwork has a certain political involvement. Nevertheless, I would like you to explain us in which way this political involvement then have a sort of output, how it can be received by the common public, and if it does, I mean, if it has a certain output.
I can just do this. Does that work? Is the question kind of like, how does the public understand my thinking about the politics in the work? Yeah. It's a good question. I would say it needs context for sure. Like, I don't expect people to walk in to this show or other shows and see these infrared videos or these paintings and necessarily be thinking about a lot of the things that I'm talking about in here. Some of that is maybe it's intentional in a certain sense that trying to think about how to say this. I didn't, my own introduction to going to art exhibitions, I wouldn't say was great when I was young. Like, I would go into art spaces a lot and not feel invited into the work many times. Even now, sometimes I go into shows and I'm feeling kind of like, am I allowed to touch this? You know, this kind of thing. And so I'm interested in aesthetics that can be an invitation into the work. And so there's different ways I could have made the landscape series, for example. I was trying to find an aesthetic way for making that work where people could hopefully like it, but let's say at least not hate it visually on the way in, and that maybe that could pull people in. Why is this video so slow? It's like a photo. Why is this infrared color? What's special about this beach? Like, that there's something there aesthetically that's not at least a total turnoff. There's a danger there in making work that's like about bigger problems that aren't always pretty and beautifying them. So I'm also conscious about that and thinking about that. But I think the way I'm trying to approach it is to make work that brings people in on some level. Maybe with the paintings, like, my hope is that maybe there's something aesthetically there through the color choice or through the imagery that's interesting, that would make them want to ask questions or come to an artist talk or look at an artist talk like this on YouTube and then get those later. Because I think the danger can be, people do it different ways, but I think there can be a danger sometimes in trying to put all of that on the wall. And then I remember going to shows sometimes where it's like, okay, if you want to understand this, here's a reading list that you need 10 books to go understand it. And that to me also doesn't always feel as fulfilling. So it's a balance. And the way I try to do it is like, yeah, I try to use the front end as a way to bring people in to hopefully want to ask enough questions to get kind of to the point where we are now. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm.
Altre domande? Se non ci sono altre domande, noi chiaramente vi invitiamo a rivedere la mostra dopo le parole che avete sentito da Evan, e poi comunque vi invitiamo anche a seguirci col ciclo, perché trovate tutto il programma qui sulla cartolina. Il prossimo incontro è il 15 febbraio e entriamo lì nel campo delle arti performative e del potenziale che offre la tecnologia. Che offre la tecnologia, ma anche il metaverse, dove oramai succedono tante cose. Sarà Federica Patti a parlarne. Lei è la curatrice della sezione dedicata proprio a queste tre pratiche del Festival Roma Europa, che sicuramente conoscete. Noi ringraziamo a tutti voi per la vostra super presenza e attenzione, e innanzitutto a Evan e anche alla nostra fantastica traduttrice, interprete Susanna. E sento Alice che... C'è una domanda? Scusami. Siamo sempre in tempo.
Però faccio in italiano perché non sono molto brava in inglese, quindi io avevo appunto questa domanda perché sto scrivendo una tesi sulla realtà e quindi che cosa vuol dire andare oltre il reale, e la mia domanda è se secondo lei la realtà è stata uccisa.
We were just about to get alcohol. No, I'm kidding. Has reality been killed? Like through technology? Is that the idea? Like, has the internet sort of destroyed our conception of what reality is?
Sì.
Yeah. It's a great question. It's one I haven't solved that one yet. Let's see. Not that I've solved anything. I think, well, if I take it back to the Pirate Bay and this idea of copy me, they have this idea that IRL is sort of a false statement where people would say, oh, let's meet IRL, like in real life. Are you familiar with this? They say AFK. Like, what does it stand for? AFK? Guys, I've been talking. Away from keyboard, right? Meaning, the basic idea meaning that like our interactions with people through the network are real, that is a part of real life, that those connections are real. And I think I buy into that perspective to some degree, that at least those relationships with people oftentimes feel very real through the network. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ultima chance.
Hi, okay. Well, I'm gonna be like tomorrow in the workshop thingy, but I have like an insane amount of questions, so we'll just start. Okay. Yeah, amazing. That's that's just perfect. But about like Pirate Bay, like, do you think there are still some online spaces that kind of still maintain that early internet vibe of freedom and sharing, also through like illegality and piracy and whatnot? Or is it like, do you think it's completely dead, or it just, I don't know?
It's still there technically. I still use it. SoulSeek, another one of those icons I showed, which is another peer-to-peer network. It actually still exists too, and it's kind of quietly existing. So there's people still there trading music files. I think that when I'm trying to be sort of optimistic, looking where the next thing is, I'm less looking towards those and other things. Like, I don't know, would have been inspiring. There was a project called Solar Protocol I thought was pretty inspiring, which was talking about making servers that were totally solar powered, so that it would move based on where the sun is, so that when you connect to the server, you're always connecting to one that's under the sun. To me, this was like a really beautiful idea anyway. That was one that was interesting to me. In general, I think though that like part of the reason the web was so inspiring to me back then, and less so now, is because it was like weird then. Like it hadn't been kind of figured out. And so I think it's interesting more than looking at, can we change the web to be that thing that it's changed from? It'd be like, what are things that are happening now that people haven't figured out how to like monetize, they haven't figured out how to turn it into a startup yet, you know? Like I would look more to those things that we can sort of experiment in that space before, like it's a common cycle. Like it happened with radio, like it happened with TV. Like cable TV used to be weird in the 80s, and then it sort of swished and came into the home. And there's these moments, I think, in technological cycles where at the very beginning, there's these moments to sort of be experimental and strange with it before everything sort of gets standardized. I don't know what those moments are, but that's where I'm looking.
Yeah, like a mannerism in the medium of like internet or something.
Right.
And like I know for the words in figure software, like I read somewhere about the NASA software for map projecting, and I work with like the NASA database because I do some scientific divulgation graphic stuff on the side. And do you think those spaces in which like you have some free content, for example, for like divulgation and whatnot, might kind of have something similar to that freedom of like the early internet, what, like for example Internet Archive, you know, some or you see them in a different way because for example they're tied to the government agencies? Or
Like, are you asking them, is the question that systems like that where they're free, like, are those ways of creating?
yeah, what's your opinion about them? Like, are they, I don't know, are they cool? Or like, I mean, I get that they're
Yeah.
like tied with the government agencies and whatnot, but
No, I mean,
What's
this
your-
is part of why that whole idea of copy me, I haven't totally there's still a part of me that just believes that, like, yeah, there's something about freely sharing data that feels at the core of what digitality is. Like, it just makes sense to me that like water flowing down a mountain, like it wants to be shared, it wants to be free. So I'm still very inspired by that. It got messy maybe when you have companies like Google and now with AI also doing this, where they love that we're all sharing all this data for free and they're using it to train their systems and then monetize it. And so it's very disappointing when all of that effort then just goes into training some system that then becomes one of the biggest companies in the world. Quite disappointing. So I'm trying to figure that way out. I usually still fall back on, okay, even given all that, I still just have this inner feeling that it should be shared. So even though I don't like the idea that I'm helping selling Google ads by putting all this stuff up for free, or that there's graphic designers right now just scraping through artists' websites and say, oh, make me something like that artist without having to pay them. Sure, it doesn't feel great, but I still kind of always come back to that idea that, like, it's maybe not, it might not be like an intellectual thought, but just from inside, it feels like, yeah, that feels kind of like the right thing to do.
Great, thanks.
So hi. I just have a question. I found extremely interesting all of your thoughts about like this internet things, and it just made me thought about interesting conversation that I had with an electrical engineer. And considering that I'm completely naive about this topic, I just asked him about how does internet work, and in the end of all of this explanation, he just said that internet is just a huge failure. It's just a huge humanity failure for how it was considered, from what it is born from, where does it came from, and how it developed into this entire situation. And I also would like to ask you your question about this topic. I mean,
like in general, is it a success or a failure?
yeah, like I think that he was more talking about the fact that with the internet we had this huge revolution that if it was just managed just a little bit better, it could like completely change the humanity, but in different directions. And this is how he considered it as a failure. I still doesn't have my idea, but maybe your answer would be also interesting as well.
Yeah, I mean, when the sun doesn't come out, that's what I think. Yeah. But I also think, at least for me, like, depression is not a strong foundation to be making artwork on. Like, I don't feel like I'm making my best work when it's just giving into dystopia. So, like, the landscapes project is like an example of that. Maybe it was really me really struggling to find optimism, really struggling to find a way to find some amount of that kind of spark of what I thought it could have been or could be. Maybe it still could be, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think my artwork is me trying to struggle through that, is trying to find optimism through these systems that feel like they might be failing.
Okay, thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
So I have this question. Since you started out along this path of making art about the materiality of the internet. How do you feel that people...
I can hear you. Yeah. My sense is more. Do you share that? Yeah, I think it's more because people are starting to notice data centers, you know, like when they drive by, they're starting to see that. I think at maybe another level, though, I don't think it's still hard to understand who owns what, like who owns that cable. It's like a conglomerate of companies and countries, and who's able to turn them off and who's able to turn them on. It's still very hard to understand. I still think I don't understand a lot of it. So my sense is that there's not a big incentive to learn more about that. We're not being incentivized by anybody to learn more about that system. We're being incentivized more to like buy more space to save our photos and subscribe to services. Like all the incentives are related to these conveniences, which are related to startups. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Let us more lonely in the trying of connect us.
Mm.
Or no?
I can't do that in yes or no. I would have said it feels like it's headed that way, right? I mean, whenever they do studies about screen time, it's always connected to depression. But I don't know. I don't know the answer because there's all these other upsides of being able to talk to my family on Zoom and like, you know, there's great examples of connectedness. I don't know the answer to that one, but it's a good question. Someone else?
Yeah, just did you do any reflection in your work in the internet, socials, and reality, this new era of internet?
Like with social media, is that what you? Like, have I engaged in it artistically?
No, yeah, artistically, yeah.
I use it professionally, I will say. Like, I use Instagram professionally. I feel forced to use it professionally because nobody really goes to websites anymore. And I remember when RSS kind of got killed. Like RSS was like a way to follow people. That was an open platform. You could connect it to anything. It was great. And I think there was no market incentive to keep that around. So when that got cut, yeah, I post on Instagram because I feel like if I don't, politically, I never had a Facebook account. I was like, I'm going to wait this shit out. I'm not getting a Facebook account. I never got a Facebook account. And then I kind of got this Instagram thing, and then now I'm on Facebook. I mean, I'm not on Facebook, but Instagram is essentially Facebook. Yeah. All these things are tricky. I was talking about this earlier. I think like all these systems that I used to be really good about not participating in, I don't know if it's me getting older or they're getting harder to not participate in. But it would feel like a really massive move to totally disconnect yourself from all these systems. Like I'm only on Instagram because I feel like if I don't have some outreach to try to get the artwork out there, it might just be me like in a forest with nobody around, you know. And maybe I'm wrong about that. I could be totally wrong about that. Thank you.